We have finally gotten that long-awaited August ban list, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over my initial thoughts on what the next format is going to look like, what are the strongest decks that we're going to see, and what are the decks that you should look out for when playing in the upcoming metagame. Do keep in mind that this is pure speculation, the format has just started, and all this could be subject to change, so do keep that in mind. But without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with the elephant in the room, Snake Eyes. I think Snake Eyes definitely wasn't hit enough. You needed to ban something like Flamberge or Original, in my opinion, for it to truly have some impact, because Ash and Poplar 1 are they're like slaps on the wrist. The deck is still playable, and they still have the Fiendsmith engine. I guess you could consider the biggest hit to the deck being Lacrima and Appaloosa, making it so they lose out on some of their generic end board pieces. But I think the thing to watch out for is that a single Moon combo still at least gets you into a rank 6, being DDD Wave High King Caesar. So even though you're not making Beatrice to start your plays, at worst you still have 2 summon negations, which is very, very strong. And now the combo might just be switched up to where you go for the Fiendsmith line first and summon the Wave King Caesar to play around a card like Nibiru, as opposed to going for Appaloosa first. So I still think this deck is going to be a very strong deck. I'm going to be a little tentative and put it at potential for tier 1. I could be wrong about this. It could still very easily be a strong tier 1, especially with the upcoming Azamina support. But until we get that support, I think that people will be excited to try out new things. And I think for that reason, people are going to stay a little bit away from this deck just because of how much they've seen it in previous formats. Now, on the other hand, Yubel is in an interesting spot. They did lose Spirit Gates to 1. I don't think this is a super big of a deal. They might just put less emphasis on the Dark Beckoning Beast package now as compared to before. They, of course, did also lose Lacrima, which is somewhat of an indirect hit. But I think the thing with Yubel and the Fiendsmith engine is that they actually use the Fiendsmith engine to summon Aerial Eater. And I think that Aerial Eater is still a very strong play that the deck can make. And I don't think that the Fiendsmith cards are going to get much weaker in the Yubel deck. I think that Yubel is definitely still a solid tier 1 deck. I don't know if it's a best deck. I'm not going to put it there just yet. But I think that it's definitely going to be one of the top contenders just because Spirit Gates isn't that big of a deal to 1. Yubel players could just play a smaller Spirit package into their deck, and they can still essentially take full advantage of the Fiendsmith package. Next up is Tempai. I think Tempai is also in a similar spot as Yubel. Yeah, they did lose some cards, Summoning to 1 and Prosperity to 1. Not super big deals. Prosperity is almost like a 1-to-1 replacement with Desires. Essentially, you could choose to play Desires in your deck, and it would generally be around the same thing. Yes, it might suck if you banish your 1 of Sanguine Summoning, but regardless, I think that the Prosperity is not that big of a deal. Summoning is interesting because, yeah, you're not going to see it as often, but there are other cards you can play like Set Rotation and Way Where There's a Will when going second. That's essentially like an extra copy of Pot of Prosperity, and while these cards you can argue are strictly worse, there's still ways to get access to the Sanguine Summoning, and if the OCG is anything to go by, then I think Tempai is not really going anywhere. It's still going to be a very solid tier 1 deck, and I don't think that's going to change. Next up is Centurion. So they did lose Calamity, but once again, Calamity wasn't necessarily always needed to win. You could make an argument that Whitewood's Centurion is just a very solid like mid-rangey combo deck that can still do well by ending on like 1 or 2 interruptions and just a bunch of follow-up. I don't think it's really going to affect the deck too much. It was probably right below tier 1 to be in the last format, and I think this format it's probably around in the same place, especially with all the new support that they're getting in the near future. Next up is Branded. Branded Fusion to 1 is not what I expected to get hit for Branded. Definitely thought Sanctifier was going to go. And speaking of Sanctifier, it's still a thing, so I don't think Branded really loses out on that much aside from maybe a little bit more consistency, but it's not like they had like a million ways to get to Branded Fusion already. So I don't think it's a super big deal for Branded once again. And you're going to notice I'm saying that a lot about this list because in general, I think this list was kind of mid. It didn't really address the problems properly. Like everything was sort of like barely touched upon, as opposed to like really digging deep and getting to the root of the problem and eliminating it. So I think that's sort of one thing I didn't like about this list, was that while yes, I feel like they did target the right decks, they just didn't do enough to hit them, unfortunately. And I guess that's sort of the case with Branded. Branded, once again, I think is also very strong potential for tier 1. It's a very solid deck, and even with 1 Branded Fusion, you have infinite ways to recur it, and You have infinite ways to search it, essentially. An interesting thing about Branded is now 60 card builds may pop up with that Grasslock Screener, because the Branded cards do synergize pretty well with having cards in the graveyard, so that could be one extra tool the Branded deck has now that they didn't necessarily have before. Next up is Lightsworn. The reason I'm putting Lightsworn on here is because Grass is back, and I think that the Lightsworn deck is a lot of fun to play. It's definitely one of those combo decks where you can almost do anything with it. It's important to note that Weiss, the level 4 Lightsworn in the picture, is a light fiend, so you can do the Fiendsmith plays as well. Of course, just milling out your deck with Grasslock Screener and just playing a bunch of good stuff in the graveyard is always going to be pretty strong, but I think the biggest problem Lightsworn still faces is that Shifter is still at 3. Shifter didn't get hit on this list, which is kind of crazy to me, but that just makes it so these crazy like grass decks can't really run rampant. And I think for that reason, I'm gonna put the Lightsworn deck in like maybe bottom of the tier 2, top of Rogue. I think it's an okay deck and definitely has a lot of potential. It can pretty much do anything in the game, which is nice, but it is sort of vulnerable to those big blowout cards like Dimension Shifter, which are still in the format. Next up is Drytron. This one is pure speculation. I don't have any experience with modern Drytron and how they would really use Eva. I think it's okay. Eva's a pretty strong card, and being able to search fairies, of course, is incredibly powerful, but I just don't know if Drytron can still compete with the current format. I could be completely wrong on this, and Drytron could have some crazy combos now that Eva's back, but I think for now, I'm gonna just put in the Rogue tier. Once again, I'd be happy to be proven wrong on this, but I personally just don't think that Drytron is that strong of a deck when compared to some of these other tier 1 contenders here. Next up is Gimmick Puppet. Gimmick Puppet losing 2 of their big XEs. I don't know if that completely shuts off the FTK. My gut feeling says it doesn't, but it does make it so they probably have to take some weirder lines, or their FTKs become like 2 card combos instead of 1 card combos, and I think that that's pretty good for in terms of like the hits. That's definitely not a deck that most people had on their radar to get hit, but I think that it's a solid hit just addressing it, because these FTKs just shouldn't really be in the game in my opinion. I think it's probably just going to be a Rogue deck now, if it's even still playable. I don't even know if you can still FTK with just the limited copies of the Xyz monsters, but I guess we'll have to see. Next up is Pendulum. They did get back Plushfire and Kieran. I'm not too sure if these will do too much for the deck. The deck wasn't doing anything at all before this, and I don't think less copies of Kieran and Plushfire were what were holding Pendulum back. I think that without a card like Electromite coming back, like this deck just probably isn't ever going to be top of the meta until Electromite comes back. And I think just even getting extra tools like Kieran, which are still pretty decent, and Plushfire, which I'm sure you can do some cool combos with, I don't think this deck is going to be very good. I'm gonna have to put it in the Rogue tier. Next up is Runic Stun, and I am a little biased against this deck. I don't like this deck, but I do think that even though with Skill Drain going to 1, it's still a very strong deck. It has like the same strengths it did before, being able to target down those other tier 1 decks. Now that every other tier 1 deck has received a small hit, I think that Runic is still on the same playing field as it was before. You can essentially build the Runic deck with so many other floodgates that could just destroy these top decks out there, and I don't think that even losing 2 copies of Skill Drain was a super big deal. So I'm gonna put Runic at the strong tier 1. I definitely think it can still outpace some of these top decks here. And then the rest of these decks weren't really touched, but I did just want to quickly go over my opinion on them, just because these are decks that are sort of relevant in the meta, but these decks weren't directly impacted by the ban list, at least from what I could tell. So starting off with Labyrinth. Labyrinth is probably still in a similar spot as it was before. I think it's an okay tier 2 deck. It maybe can do a little better now that decks like Snake Eyes and Yubel are a little bit slower, but that's sort of hard to say because Labyrinth is still not necessarily in the best spot in terms of still having to play a bunch of hand traps in order to compete with these top decks out here. Plants, I also think, is in a similar spot. There's still hand traps probably going to be running around. There's probably going to be still at least 15 to 18 copies of hand traps in most people's decks, in my opinion, just because these decks are still incredibly strong, and I think that Plants is still going to suffer a little bit from that. Vanquish Soul, I don't think this is a very good deck. In general, I always put Vanquish Soul in Rogue, and I don't think it ever does anything more than that. Pure Kashtira is probably still okay. It's, I would say, near like the top of tier 2. Shifter still at 3, which is crazy, and Shifter can single-handedly carry games. Not to mention the Cash Engine is still pretty solid. There's nothing inherently wrong with the Cash Engine monsters even today, so I think that it's a solid tier 2 deck. Melodious is interesting because in some way you can argue the Appaloosa hit did affect it, because now it's less good in terms of making like generic end boards, but it's still pretty solid in making its like Melodious end board with like the Flowering Etoile. I think it's a solid tier 2 deck. One thing I will say about this is the engine with Ostinato to make like a bunch of negates before you commit anything is probably not going to be as good anymore because we don't have Appaloosa. Next up is Tearlament. I think Tearlament, unfortunately, is still suffering from the same problems that it did have before. Although Grass coming back is probably something that is a welcome sight for Tearlament players, I still don't think the deck is going to be super great. It's probably in the same boat as Lightsworn. It just suffers too much from like all the hand traps that are being played in the format. People are still going to be playing Shifter. People are still going to be playing Bystials for the feats with stuff. I don't think that Tearlament's got too much of a boost from this previous list, so maybe some crazy 60 card abomination with Grass can potentially do well by mixing everything together. Voiceless Voice is probably also still okay. I would say it's maybe like the bottom of potential for tier 1, top of tier 2. All the other decks did get slightly weaker, and I think that makes Voiceless Voice a little bit better just because it sort of was quietly outpaced by like all these top decks, but now that all of them are slightly worse, I think that Voiceless has a little bit better of a chance to compete, although I don't think he'll be taking over the meta anytime soon. Chimera is interesting because I think Chimera used Beatrice as well, and I'm not too sure what the combos are nowadays without Beatrice, but I imagine that Chimera Fiendsmith is still a very solid deck. You can still take full advantage of the Fiendsmith engine. The Chimera cards are still very powerful. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the deck. I'd probably put it like top of tier 2, bottom of potential for tier 1. Ritual Beast. I think Ritual Beast is also a very strong deck still. Shifter's still at 3. Shifter's one heck of a card, and we still have Protos. They can still make Colossus. Don't think much has changed for Ritual Beast. It's probably just on the fringe of top of tier 1. Next up is Salamangreat. I think Salamangreat is also in a similar spot. Nothing really changed for the deck. I think it's probably middle of the pack tier 2. Not super great, not terrible. I don't really know what else to say about the deck. Pearly, also similar spot as Salamangreat. I don't really think it's changed from before. Off the top of my head, nothing super crazy changed for Pearly, and I think that it's still going to suffer from the same problems that it did before. Fluandreeze, I don't think this deck is very good, but Shifter's still at 3, and Shifter, like I mentioned for the other Shifter decks, can single-handedly carry games. So I'm going to put Fluandreeze probably top of tier 2. Sprite is in an interesting spot because Sprite, I think, got slightly better because it was also in a similar boat as Voiceless Voice. It's a totally okay deck, but it was just outpaced by all these other powerful decks out there, like Yubel and Full Power Snake Eyes. So I think that now that these decks are a little bit worse, I think Sprite has a chance to shine a little bit, so I think it has potential for tier 1. The deck is still pretty solid. And similar with Memento as Sprite and Voiceless Voice, it's still a very strong deck, and even though the Fiendsmith engine got hit, I think the Memento deck can still use it, although I could be wrong on this. If they can still use the Fiendsmith engine to like almost its full potential, I'd probably put it at potential for tier 1. Otherwise, if you have to take the Fiendsmith cards out now that Lacrima's dead, I'd probably put it in tier 2. But for now, I just leave it at the bottom of potential for tier 1. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. I just want to quickly run over my initial thoughts just by seeing the list at the start. Once again, this is purely speculative. I could be completely wrong on a lot of these decks. I might be underestimating Snake Eyes Fiendsmith, but I truly believe that it's a good deck still, but I just feel like people want to play something different, and I think that that's going to cause some people to either shift more towards Yubel or towards other meta options that can still be powerful. But once again, this is just my opinion and my opinion only. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and let me know what you thought about the ban list and what you think the best decks are going to be next format in the comment section below. So with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.